Welcome to the third part of this tutorial series about how to create an application from services for the IIP-Ecosphere platform. This is the third step in the whole process to creating our application, our basic application, and it consists of three sub-steps. Like first we define the application, then we define a service mesh, and then we create the templates to further work on this to build the application. Prerequisites for this is we have an installed platform with its dependencies, we have an IDE we can work with, best using the one we provide, as it has everything you need to create services in it. You should know how to configure data types and how to configure services. Optionally, you could have looked at how code generation works just to get a bit more familiar with the IIP files. How do you configure the application? Firstly, let's discuss what an application and a service mesh is, because these work together. A service mesh defines connection between services as a directed graph. So it defines the data flow from one service to another one in a fixed direction. The graph's roots are one or multiple source services because data is flowing from them, and the graph terminates at sync services or a sync service. An application consists of multiple service meshes or just one. In our example, we will just use one. So what we can see in the image is these parts are firstly different levels of our final code artifact we would execute. So we have the application at first, which is our basic top level artifact, which then calls the service mesh, which then calls the source service as a starting point. From there on, the service mesh connections take over and deal with the data flow. Our source service would initially, when called upon, just wait for data to get in, so it actually does something. The sync service would end this whole chain. We define the application in all application part IVML, which a little code example can be seen on the bottom left side of the screen. We first have the application itself. It's called My App, which consists of one or more mesh services. These services, like mentioned before, can be reusable. We have an ID, which is the ID of the application when using the command line interface to interact with it. And we have services. The services in this case are defined by a service mesh by name. This can be many service meshes, like mentioned, but in our case, for the simplicity of the example, will just be one. How do we configure a service mesh? Like I've mentioned, it defines like a directed graph data flow. We first start with a name for the service mesh, so service mesh my mesh, and then start chaining together our services. This is done by having an alternation between a connector and a service each time, so we can see we have my source, my connector, my source transformer, my connector, my transformer, my receiver. So we alternate between these two steps. Each service in the mesh has a type, like mesh source, mesh sync, or mesh processor, which define what the service is supposed to be doing. If you're having a synchronous service, you have a poll interval. This is not needed if you're having an asynchronous service. Moving on, we have impl, where you put the name of the service, which implements this mesh source. So you've defined services, you've given them names in our examples. This is something like service, transformer, and sync, and in this case we call that source. And then you give a next. So what is the next step after this service? We have the impl, which refers to the service that's at this mesh element. So my mesh source is a mesh element with, as basically code behind it, the source we've defined. Our source service in this case would be called source. I'm talking about the IVML variable, not the name you've given the service. Next defines what comes after this mesh element, usually a connector. As I mentioned, you alternate between these. The connector has a name. This is by convention service error to a service, which is more for documentation purposes. Now we generate the templates because we've defined our data types, we've defined our services, and we've defined the application based on our services. The template for the IVML files should enable you to theoretically build an application from now on. The template is something provided in the development container, so if you're working without it, you're probably not able to just take something from our examples and run with it. Mind you, we've not implemented functionality up until now, so it wouldn't do much. What we do now is we run mvn generate sources to get and unpack the meta model, which is seen on the right side, and to generate the gen directory in which our template project lies, as well as most other generated parts for this application. What you should have learned is how to configure the service mesh and how to configure the application. Also how to generate the templates from this and potentially regenerate if needed. How you could go on is how to test the application, how you should go on is how to build the application, because that would be the actual next step.